Chapter 30, Section 1, Revolutions in Russia. Essentially, the Russian Revolution had taken a long time, and the final straw comes in 1917, after there had been a whole bunch of cruel and oppressive rule by the czars that would cause a lot of widespread social unrest all throughout the time. You have army officers revolting all throughout these periods. And with Alexander II, you're having Russia heading toward a full-scale revolution. Next slide. The czars resist change. In 1881, Alexander III is going to succeed his father, Alexander II, and halt all the reforms that had taken place in Russia. He clings to these principles of what's known as autocracy, or a form of government in which he has total power. And anyone who would question that authority, who worshipped worshipped outside of the Russian Orthodox Church, or spoke a language other than Russian, was labeled as dangerous. And they continue this rule for quite some time. To wipe out any revolutionaries, Alexander III used very harsh measures that he went about. He imposes strict censorship on published materials and written documents, including private letters. He had his secret police carefully watch out all kinds of schools and universities, and if you were reported as one of these places, you could be sent to places like Siberia, which is a very remote region towards eastern Russia. Establishing a uniform Russian culture as well, he's going to oppress other types of groups outside of this. And when Tsar Nicholas II becomes Tsar, he continues on those traditions that Alexander had put in place. Next slide. Rapid industrialization goes into effect and changes Russia. The number of factories doubles between 1863 and 1900, but they're still lagging behind a lot of Western European nations. In the 1890s, Nicholas, who was the most capable of the ministers, launches a program that's going to move the country forward. Those steps include heavy industry growth, particularly in steel, and they're producing at a high rate of steel by the 1900s. They're the fourth ranked, only behind the United States, Germany, and Great Britain. They also have a railway that's taking place, the Trans-Siberian Railway, that begins in 1891. It's completed in 1916, and it creates this this huge line of railway that you can see there on the slide. Next slide. Revolutionary movement grows. The rapid industrialization causes a lot of issues amongst people in Russia. The growth of factories brings about new problems. You have working conditions, low wages, child labor, all of these issues that you see in other countries as well, but in Russia it's really, really big. As a result of this, you have revolutionary movements that begin to come into play. And a group that follows Karl Marx successfully establishes the following in Russia. You have Marxist revolutionaries who believe that the industrial class is going to rise up, okay? And they alone would be able to form a dictatorship of what's known as the proletariat. And the proletariat is the workers, essentially meaning that the workers would rule the country. In 1903, you have the two groups that are going to split apart from the Russian Marxists. You have the Mensheviks, who wanted a broad base of popular support for the revolution, and a more radical group called the Bolsheviks. And they will support a number of committed revolutionaries willing to work for that. And the major leader of that group is a guy by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He adopts the name of Lenin. That's probably where most of us know his name from. And he had a very engaging personality and was very excellent at organizing, but he's ruthless as well. And some of those traits would ultimately help him gain command of the Bolsheviks. He has to flee Western Europe to avoid arrest by the Tsarist regime, but eventually will return back. Next slide. Crisis at home and abroad. Some of the issues: the Russo-Japanese War, late 1800s, Russia and Japan compete for control of Korea and Manchuria in China, and in that upper eastern portion of China. The two nations signed a series of agreements over the territories, but Russia breaks them, and Japan retaliates by attacking a Russian port. They lose those battles, and that causes a lot of issues at home. Next, Bloody Sunday, the revolution of 1905. 200,000 workers and their families approached the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying with them a petition for better working conditions, more personal freedoms, essentially having a national legislature. And Nicholas II's generals ordered soldiers to fire on the crowd, and more than 1,000 were wounded, several hundred killed. And the Russians quickly named the event Bloody Sunday. It provoked a wave of violence that spreads all throughout the country. In October 1905, Nicholas reluctantly establishes what's known as a Duma. Okay? And the Duma was Russia's first parliament. They meet in 1906, but the leaders are eventually going to be disbanded and dissolved after about 10 weeks. Lastly, guys, World War I. That becomes the final blow. Essentially, Nicholas makes this decision to drag Russia into the war. And in doing so, they don't have the military that is capable of standing up to Germany. They only have people. So before years passed, more than 4 million Russian soldiers had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It's a huge number in 1 year. And Nicholas moves his headquarters to the war front. There, some issues take place as well. His wife takes over and puts in place a guy by the name of Rasputin. He was a self-described holy man, and he is gaining powers from some of these issues because he's helped out Alexander's son from who was suffering, and he seemed to ease that tension. So he's given the power to actually have some of these issues. Anyway, it turns out very bad for Russia, and things are going so badly on the war front that it's going to be a huge force. The March Revolution, which is the next slide. Women textile workers in Petrograd lead a citywide strike in the next 5 days, and riots flare up over shortages of bread, fuel, all these different things. About 2,000 workers swarm the streets, and at first the soldiers are obeying orders to shoot them, but later they side with that group, and those actions are going to force Tsar Nicholas to abdicate his throne, which means to give up. A provisional government known as the Duma takes over and continues the war effort. And this is the time when Lenin comes back to Russia because they feel he could be a big revolutionary factor. And also, you have other groups that want him there that are going to be a part of this. Germany brings him back because they feel like it would get Russia out of the war. The Bolshevik Revolution. Next slide. Lenin and the Bolsheviks are going to gain control of what's known as the Petrograd Soviet. And a Soviet were local councils that consist of workers, peasants, and different soldiers. And he takes over that one. And by the fall of 1970, people in the cities are rallying to the call. All power to the Soviets. Lenin's slogan was peace, land, and bread. And that gains widespread appeal all throughout Russia. Lenin actually declines to take any kind of action. Decides to take action. And the workers will actually storm the palace and claim themselves to be the Soviet Red Guard, and the Bolsheviks are going to take over. And that Red Guard is going to last for a while. Lenin, now in power, is going to order all farmland to be distributed amongst the peasants, and also takes Russia out of the war. He signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which we've looked at in class, that video from YouTube. He signs that treaty with Germany that removes them from the war. And from this point on, we're going to start to see a style that takes place and a civil war. Next slide. As the Civil War does rage on, opponents form two different groups, the White Army to go against what was the Bolshevik Red Army. And the White Army was going to be supported by places like the United States. They would send military forces to help out the White Army. However, they're very, very ill-commanded and not really able to do anything. The commander of the Red Army is another brilliant leader for the Soviets. His name is Leon Trotsky. He commands the Red Army, in which they crush basically all opposition. You have about 14 million people who will end up dying in this struggle all throughout this time period. Life of loss, fighting, hunger, that worldwide flu epidemic that we discussed in here as well, that Spanish flu that was running all throughout. But the Red Army is victorious, and it shows that the Bolsheviks were able to seize power and also maintain it. And when we look at the Russian Revolution, in comparison to the American Revolution and the French Revolution, there is more of a comparison between the French than there is the American. And the reason is those two revolutions both try to topple governments in their homeland, and they're willing to use violence to control those things. So those civil wars happen within that country, whereas the Americans are breaking free from a different portion of those groups. Next slide. Lenin is going to order and restore order in these new ideals. He creates the NEP, or the New Economic Policy, which is strange because it's a small-scale version of capitalism. Now, capitalism itself is essentially you can make money in a private economy, whereas what communism that we're more familiar with that group is known for is a very state-controlled economy, but in this case, a small-scale version of capitalism. So people, after the state gets what they need, are able to sell anything that was left over for themselves. The government's still going to control the major industries, banks, and communication systems, but they do allow a little bit of that, and that was needed to get the country going. By 1928, Russians' farms are producing as much as they had prior to World War I, so we're starting to see this coming about. Next, nationalism. This is seen as a threat in the country. Why? Essentially, what you don't want is a bunch of people trying to give this portion. So what do? They reorganize the country into governing republics that's all under a central government. And they rename the country the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. And the party that becomes a part of this is renamed as the Communist Party. After the writings from Karl Marx, where he uses the word communism to describe these classless societies that he had created. Next slide. After Lenin comes to power, he is going to suffer a stroke around 1922. He survives the incident, but it sets in motion a competition that heads up the Communist Party. Two of the most notable men are Leon Trotsky, who we've talked about, who was the commander of the Red Army, and Joseph Stalin. Stalin himself is very cold, very hard. He's impersonable, but a lot like Lenin when we look at Lenin when he was younger. During his early days, he changes his name to Stalin, which means man of steel in Russian. And he begins his ruthless climb to the head of the government in 1922, between 22 and 27. He's the general secretary of the Communist Party, and he works behind the scenes to move his supporters into positions of power. So, Lenin believes that Stalin is a very dangerous man. Before he dies, he said, Comrade Stalin has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I'm not sure that he always knows how to use that power. By 1928, Stalin was in total command of the Communist Party. Trotsky is actually forced into exile into Mexico in 1929, where he is later murdered, kind of strangely as to how it goes. That is the end of this section, guys. We'll work more on a sheet that you guys will have to do now. So if you're finished with this, come and get that sheet from me.